When I first drove past the Welcome to Maple Ridge sign, it felt like I was crossing into a different chapter of my life. Not a new book, not a new genre, just a different chapter, quieter and less cluttered. After 32 years of working as a structural engineer, and 17 of those years spent juggling conference calls and chemotherapy appointments for my late wife, I wanted something simple, something quiet, something soft. Maple Ridge was that place. Nestled just outside of the city, it was a tidy little suburban community with white fences, bird feeders, and HOA newsletters printed in cheerful fonts. The houses all had small porches, most, with rocking chairs that looked like they'd seen more lemonade than arguments. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved to strangers and dogs had names like Buttons or Snickers. On the surface, it was perfect, and maybe that's what drew me in. The illusion of peace. The idea that after all the chaos and heartbreak, I could land somewhere still. The house I bought was a modest 2-story with a brick chimney and a faded blue door. The previous owner had left a few wind chimes on the porch and an old barbecue grill out back that looked like it hadn't been used since the Clinton administration. But the bones were solid. The garden was overgrown in a charming way. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. There was only one thing I did the very first week after moving in, one change, one expression of who I was and what this new life meant to me. I painted the house. Not entirely, of course, just the exterior panels and the front door. The original color was a dull beige that looked like it had given up halfway through being painted. I chose a soft sage green with warm cream trim, calming, natural welcoming. The kind of green you'd find in an old forest or a grandmother's quilt. It wasn't neon, it wasn't rebellious. It was simply me. As I rolled the final strokes on the garage trim, a neighbor across the street gave me a thumbs up and shouted, "Nice choice. Looks like spring finally moved in." I smiled. That evening, as I sipped tea on the porch, watching the sun melt into the rooftops, I whispered to no one in particular, Carol would have liked this. And I meant it. Carol had always dreamed of living in a home with personality. She'd clipped photos from magazines, bookmarked interior blogs, and talked about how color made a house sing. When she passed, I promised myself that if I ever settled again, I'd make that house sing for her. This sage green was her favorite. It wasn't long before I unpacked the last box, rearranged the books by subject instead of alphabet, and filled the front room with the soft sound of her favorite jazz records. I finally had a space where the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like presence. But silence has a way of warning you before it breaks. And it broke the very next week. I found the letter folded neatly in a white HOA envelope tucked into my mailbox, like a serpent hiding in a bouquet. Notice of violation. Non-compliant paint color. The language was stern, passive-aggressive, and condescending all at once. According to the HOA design and aesthetic standards, my paint choice did not conform to the neutral earth tone palette approved by the Homeowners Association of Maple Ridge. A fine of $1,000 would be levied if the paint was not reverted to acceptable colors within 14 days. I read it 3 times. Then I read it aloud. Then I laughed. Not a bitter laugh. Not yet. Just a laugh of disbelief. There had been no prior warning, no neighborly knock, no friendly reminder. Just a bill, a penalty, an order. That night, I reread the HOA welcome packet I'd skimmed when I bought the house. I highlighted every section about design restrictions. There was no clause, no appendix, no mention of sage green being a violation. I even cross-checked the RGB codes provided in the digital PDF. Nothing. As I dug deeper, I found something interesting. There was a line that said homeowners are encouraged to maintain exterior aesthetics in line with Maple Ridge tradition. No hard rules, just a suggestion. I'd worked in engineering long enough to know the difference between policy and preference. And that letter, that was all preference. But preference in the wrong hands can be weaponized. The next morning, I tried to call the HOA office. The number went straight to voicemail. I left a calm, respectful message asking for clarification. No one called back. Instead, 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one with red ink and a typed notice stating that the fine would increase to $1,500 if no corrective action was taken by the end of the week. It was signed by the HOA president herself. Karen Whitmore. The name rang familiar. I remembered her now, a sharp-looking woman in her late 50s with perfectly ironed khaki pants, walking a Pomeranian named Winston like it was royalty. She'd waved to me once curtly but didn't stop to introduce herself. Apparently, Karen didn't do introductions. She did enforcement. So I did something I hadn't done since I retired. I got serious. I pulled out my old field notebook and began logging everything. Dates, correspondence, photographs, copies of paint receipts, a record of the neighbor who had complimented me. I even drove around the neighborhood and took discreet photos of other houses, with color schemes far brighter than mine. There was a salmon pink ranch on Sycamore Drive, a lavender bungalow 2 streets over, and my personal favorite, a hideous mustard yellow duplex with burnt orange shutters that looked like a hot dog stand. All untouched, all unpunished. That evening, I sat on the porch with a legal pad and 2 mugs of coffee, one for me, one for Carol's memory, and said, if they want to play petty, let's play precise. What I didn't know then was just how far Karen was willing to go. But she didn't know me either. She didn't know that under my grief, under the quiet man painting his house, lived someone who had spent his life solving complex problems, negotiating million-dollar contracts, and designing earthquake-proof bridges. And she had just given me a reason to build something again. Not a structure, a stand. The morning light spilled across my porch like a warm invitation, and I almost believed the day would be normal. I just finished pruning the overgrown lilac bushes along the fence, and was about to reward myself with a second cup of coffee, when I saw it another envelope. Same logo, same tidy HOA letterhead, tucked into the mailbox like a thorn in a bouquet. I stood still for a moment, letting the breeze rustle through my shirt as I stared at the letter in my hand. It felt too soon for round 2. I peeled it open slowly, scanning the text with growing disbelief. Subject, escalation of violation. Paint color, non-compliance. Fine due, $1,000. Due to the homeowner's failure to take corrective action regarding the unauthorized paint color, the Homeowners Association hereby imposes a fine of $1,000 effective immediately. Additional penalties may accrue if the matter is not resolved within the next 5 business days. Signed once again by Karen Whitmore, president of the Maple Ridge HOA. My heart wasn't racing. It wasn't anger that gripped me yet. It was that same hollow bewilderment you get when life smacks you with something so absurd, your brain stalls just trying to process it. I had done everything by the book. No rules were broken, no guidelines violated. And yet here I was, being fined like I'd set fire to the clubhouse. I walked inside, laid the letter on the kitchen counter, and stared at the sage green walls around me. They looked calm, peaceful, comforting, like sanctuary. But apparently to Karen, they looked like war. I picked up my phone and called the number listed at the bottom of the letter. It rang 4 times before a chipper voice answered. Maple Ridge HOA office. This is Donna speaking. Hi, Donna, I said calmly. My name is Thomas Reed. I received a violation notice and would like to understand the specific rule I've allegedly broken. Oh yes, she replied. You're the one with the, greenhouse. I am, I said. And I've reviewed the community guidelines thoroughly. There's no mention of that color being disallowed. She hesitated. Well, the board does reserve the right to make decisions based on the overall aesthetic of the neighborhood. That sounds more like a preference than a policy, I said, still even-toned. Could you please direct me to the exact clause that justifies a $1,000? Fine. Another pause. I'll have to ask Ms. Whitmore to get back to you on that. Donna said a little less chipper now. She's currently out of the office. Of course, I replied. Please let her know I'll be expecting her call. I hung up and stared at the kitchen clock. It ticked rhythmically in the background as if marking time for an invisible countdown. This was no longer about paint. It was about power. Karen hadn't responded to facts, nor to neighborly discussion. She had escalated immediately to punishment, to fear, to force. and judging by how quickly the second letter had arrived, she'd done it before. I remembered something my wife Carol once said during her cancer treatments. She told me that when people feel out of control in their own lives, they try to control others. She said it softly, but it stuck with me. I wondered what Karen had lost that made her hold so tightly to neighborhood dominance. Still, insight didn't equal tolerance. That night, I walked around the neighborhood, not just for air, but for information. At 6:42 p.m., I saw Karen walking Winston down the sidewalk with the same military precision she'd used to deliver her verdicts. I gave a polite nod. She didn't return it. 3 houses down, I saw a couple repainting their shutters a bold navy blue. I stopped to compliment them. "You're lucky you didn't choose green," I joked lightly. The woman laughed. "Green?" "Why, Karen's not a fan," I said, holding up my phone with a picture of the letter. Her smile faltered. "You're not the first." It turns out Karen had flagged multiple homes in the past for non-conforming aesthetics, but few had pushed back. Most paid the fines, repainted, and moved on. Some quietly sold their homes, unable to bear the constant policing. "Everyone's afraid of rocking the boat," the husband said. "She's got her little board of yes men, and they'll do whatever she says." I thanked them and walked back to my porch. That night, I pulled up the public registry for Maple Ridge's HOA bylaws. I wasn't just reading anymore, I was highlighting, annotating, documenting. I created a folder titled Colorgate and started printing every page that contradicted her actions. It was slow, methodical work, the kind that engineers like me are good at. And in between the legal jargon and overlapping clauses, I found my leverage. There were no penalties allowed for aesthetic disagreements unless the color had been previously submitted and denied in writing. I had submitted nothings because submission was not required for touch-up paint under the value of $2,500, a clause hidden in a footnote on page 17. My house had cost me $742 in paint and supplies. I had receipts. In other words, her fine was unenforceable. But Karen hadn't sent that fine to enforce law. She sent it to enforce her. Still, I wasn't going to march over to her door or shout during the next HOA meeting. That wasn't my way. That wasn't Carol's way either. I'd play the long game. And so I began gathering more than just paperwork. I started looking at the HOA itself, their structure, their leases, their finances, and that's when I found something interesting. The HOA didn't own its office, it leased it from a property management company that had recently listed the building for sale. It was almost poetic. They had fined me $1,000 over paint while squatting in a rental with no idea who might buy it next. As I shut down my computer that night, I leaned back and let out a quiet, satisfied breath. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. They had opened the first move. Now it was my turn. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, I had been labeled. Not just as the greenhouse guy, but something more threatening, in Karen's eyes, non-compliant. A term that in military circles meant someone who wouldn't follow orders. In Maple Ridge, it meant someone who wouldn't bow to Karen's invisible crown. The meeting was held at the community clubhouse, a small beige structure, with carpet that smelled faintly of mildew and coffee creamer. I arrived 10 minutes early and took a seat near the back, clipboard in hand, wearing a navy button-up Carol had once bought me for our anniversary. People trickled in, neighbors I had only waved to, some who avoided eye contact now, and others who offered awkward smiles. Karen arrived exactly on time, carrying a leather folio and an air of command that would have impressed a courtroom bailiff. She wore a maroon blouse, gold brooch, and that sharp, perpetually disappointed expression. "Let's begin," she said, tapping the microphone like a talk show host. After the routine agenda, minutes from last meeting, landscaping budget, trash collection updates, she moved on to community compliance and aesthetic standards. Her tone shifted like a violin tuning before a dramatic solo. "We've had a few unfortunate examples recently," she began, scanning the room like a schoolteacher hunting for the gum chewer. "Homes that have deviated from the agreed-upon visual guidelines. One in particular has chosen a shade of green that, while not expressly banned in the outdated documentation, is completely out of sync with our community's character." I raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. "It's about preserving value," she continued. A house that doesn't conform can reduce curb appeal, which reduces everyone's property value. It's not personal, it's principle. There was a murmur of agreement from her usual allies, board member Dean, the retired dentist, Cheryl, who ran the gardening committee like a botanical dictatorship, and Mike, who mowed his lawn with the precision of a NASA engineer. Then Karen did something that even I didn't expect. She pointed. To the homeowner in question, Mr. Thomas Reed, thank you for joining us this evening. Every head in the room turned toward me. I felt the air thin. I'd like to offer you the opportunity to explain your color choice, Karen said sweetly, though her eyes held something closer to venom. I stood up slowly, clipboard in hand. My color choice, I said calmly, was sage green, a soft neutral tone meant to reflect the natural tree canopy and complement the earth tones in this neighborhood. A few people nodded. I continued. I reviewed the HOA guidelines carefully. Nowhere does it list prohibited colors, nor does it require submission of paint choices unless a structural alteration is being made. Mine wasn't. I painted wood trim and panels that already existed. Karen smiled tightly. The guidelines may be outdated, but the board has discretion. Discretion, I echoed, isn't the same as unilateral authority. There's no transparency, no appeals process, and apparently no due process when it comes to fines. I was issued a $1,000 fine, with no hearing, no warning, and no dialogue. Karen's smile faltered slightly. Dean shifted in his seat. That was the board's decision, Karen said. Was it, I asked? Or was it yours? A hush settled across the room. Karen blinked visibly, weighing her next words. I have spoken to several neighbors, I continued. Many of them shared similar stories. Arbitrary warnings, inconsistent enforcement, selective punishments, some even repainted just to avoid conflict. I could see it in their faces, relief, recognition, even guilt. But I won't be bullied, I finished. This isn't about paint, it's about power. And I think we need to ask why one person's aesthetic opinion holds more weight than the entire neighborhood's. Cheryl leaned in to whisper something to Mike. Dean cleared his throat and looked down at his notepad. Karen clasped her hands. Well, she said coolly, thank you for your comments. Moving on, next on the agenda, we'll discuss the spring flower beds. But the mood had shifted. She knew it. I knew it. On my way out, an elderly man named Frank patted my shoulder. You said what I couldn't, he whispered. Good for you. I didn't smile. I just nodded. I wasn't here to make enemies or win applause. I was here because I had a right to be, and now more than ever, I knew I wasn't alone. Later that night, I took a walk around the neighborhood again. The air smelled like jasmine and warm earth. I passed by houses with peeling shutters, mismatched fences, and garish lawn ornaments, all untouched by the HOA's wrath. It was never about harmony. It was always about control. And Karen had waged her little war on the one man who no longer feared losing things, because I'd already lost the most important person in my life. The worst she could do now was underestimate me, which in her case was a very bad idea. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee, a yellow legal pad, and a printed copy of the HOA bylaws. The binder had been buried in the welcome packet they'd handed me when I moved in, thick with outdated formatting and legalese. But as far as I was concerned, it was the HOA's Bible. If Karen was going to wield it like scripture, I intended to read every verse. I spent the entire morning cross-referencing clauses, page 6, section B3. Structural changes must be submitted for review. No mention of cosmetic updates like paint. Page 14. Yard ornaments must not exceed 4 feet in height. Irrelevant. Page 22. Listed examples of architectural violation: sheds without permits, unapproved fences, visible satellite dishes, but nowhere. Not once did it mention paint color. The closest I found was a vague line on page 31. Homeowners are encouraged to maintain aesthetic consistency in line with community values. That's it. Encouraged, not required. And certainly not punishable by a $1,000 fine. So Karen's claim her weaponized interpretation of community tradition was built on sand. Still, I needed confirmation. I called the number listed for HOA Legal Liaison, which connected me to a voicemail that hadn't been set up. So I called the city's planning department. A woman named Lydia answered, and after explaining my situation, she chuckled dryly. Happens all the time, she said. HOAs like to act like micro-governments. But unless their bylaws specifically prohibit it, they're just bluffing. What about enforcement, I asked. They threatened to lien on my property. They'd have to prove a violation first, Lydia said. And if it's not written down, it's not enforceable. You could challenge it in small claims. That evening, I typed up a formal letter. I cited every page of the HOA guidelines that supported my case and closed with a request. Please provide written justification for the $1,000 fine with reference to the relevant HOA bylaw within 10 business days. Failure to do so will be considered an acknowledgement of the fine's invalidity. I hand-delivered it to the HOA mailbox. For 2 days, there was silence. Then a letter arrived, not typed, but handwritten in looping cursive. Dear Mr. Reed, thank you for your feedback. The HOA maintains the right to preserve neighborhood character through discretionary review. While certain rules may not be codified, we believe in the spirit of uniformity. The fine stands. Sincerely, Karen Fletcher, President, Maple Ridge, HOA. Spirit of uniformity. It sounded like something out of a dystopian novel. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a declaration of authority. I realized then that Karen didn't care about the rules because she believed she was the rule. The guidelines were tools, not boundaries. They existed to justify her decisions, not limit them. I could have let it go, paid the fine, repainted the house, moved on. But something about that note made me pause. Maybe it was the condescension. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't even bother to type it. Or maybe it was because I saw Carol's handwriting in the curves of that script, and it stung. Not because it resembled my wife's, but because it represented everything Carol had stood against. Arbitrary power, petty cruelty, pretending something mattered when it only served ego. Carol used to say peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of fairness. This wasn't fair, and now I knew it wouldn't stop at paint. If Karen got away with this, what came next? My flower beds, my mailbox, my porch light? No. This was the line. I started researching HOA law. I read case studies, court filings, even Reddit threads from homeowners who had fought back and won. I learned that HOA boards often relied on fear of legal fees to suppress challenges, but that most of their power depended on community ignorance and apathy. But I wasn't apathetic. Not anymore. The next weekend, I invited a few neighbors over. I kept it casual, just coffee and conversation on my front porch. Frank came. So did Aisha from 2 doors down, and Michael, a young father with twin boys. We talked about grass height warnings, sidewalk, chalk bans, even a woman who'd been fined for hanging wind chimes. They were tired. Tired of arbitrary fines, of Karen's clipboard patrols, of feeling like they were living under constant surveillance. This isn't what I signed up for when I bought here, Aisha said. It's not what anyone signed up for, I replied. And as I watched the sunset reflect off my perfectly sage-green house, I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about taking back our voice. It was about showing Karen that community wasn't something she controlled. It was something we created together. The battle lines weren't drawn in paint. They were drawn in silence. And I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. I woke up to a thud on my front step. The kind of thud that carried weight, literally and figuratively. It wasn't a package or a newspaper tossed carelessly by a delivery boy. It was too heavy, too deliberate. When I opened the door, a manila envelope sat upright against the doorframe. No postage, no label. Just one word printed in thick black Sharpie notice. My stomach tightened. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the folded documents inside. There were 5 pages each, stamped in red with the HOA's emblem. A fake-looking crest they'd designed a few years back, with 2 pine trees, a fountain, and the words, "Preserving our character" in faux Latin. But what those pages said made my blood boil. It was an official notice of lien filing. Karen, it seemed, had gone for the nuclear option. Since I hadn't complied by repainting my house or paying the fine, the HOA had approved a lien for non-payment. They claimed I owed not just the original $1,000, but also $300 in administrative costs and $450 in legal review and collection processing fees. $1.07 over paint. I sat down hard on the porch step, clutching the papers, heart pounding. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was an attack on my home. A lien meant they were placing a claim against my property title. If I ever wanted to refinance, sell, or even transfer the deed to someone else, I'd have to deal with it. It was leverage. It was a threat. And it was personal. I paced inside for hours, rereading every word. Their justification was full of vague references, aesthetic cohesion, neighborhood harmony, and one phrase that made me laugh bitterly. To uphold the visual values historically celebrated within the Maple Ridge community. I pulled out the HOA bylaws again. Still no clause about paint colors, still no list of approved palettes, still nothing that justified this lien. But HOA boards didn't always need proof. They just needed people to believe they had the power. And if no one pushed back, that power calcified into precedent. I wasn't going to be another precedent. I made a call to a local real estate attorney, Jeff Mercer, a sharp mid-40s guy I'd met at a Rotary meeting years ago. He listened as I explained the situation. "Let me guess," he said. "Karen Fletcher, yup. She's got a reputation," he muttered. "You're not the first to end up in her crosshairs. But a lien, without clear violation, that's weak." He offered to file a formal response, but he was honest about the timeline. It could take months to fight the lien in small claims court. They count on that, Jeff said. Delay, paperwork, bureaucracy. They think you'll just pay to make it go away. But I wasn't wired that way. Something in me had snapped. Maybe it was the way Karen had smiled at the last meeting, or the way some neighbors had started looking at me like I was the problem. Maybe it was Carol again, her voice in my head saying, "If they can do it to you, they'll do it to someone else." I didn't want to just win. I wanted to change the rules. That night, while lying awake in bed, I thought back to something Frank had said 2 weeks earlier. We'd been talking about how the HOA always held meetings in the same tired strip mall, Unit 9, next to a dry cleaner and a vape shop. Frank had joked, you'd think, for all the power they have, they'd at least own the building. And then, something clicked. I sat upright, reached for my laptop, and typed into a commercial real estate site. Sure enough, the strip mall was owned by a mid-sized property group, and one of the units, Unit 9, was listed as available. I blinked. Then I refreshed the page. Still available. I called the number the next morning and got connected to a leasing manager named Scott. Yeah, he confirmed. Unit 9's lease is expiring next month. Current tenants haven't renewed. Interested, very. I said, doing my best not to let my voice tremble. But I didn't want to lease it. I wanted to own it. Turns out the entire strip mall, 6 units total, was on the market quietly. The ownership group was looking to offload the property to consolidate assets. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't outrageous either. They were looking for a quick close, and the price was negotiable. I called Jeff again. Think we can set up an LLC and make a cash offer through it? There was a pause. You're serious as a lien on my house? Jeff laughed. Let's do it. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked silently. While Karen paraded around with her clipboard, I had conference calls with brokers, pored over zoning maps, reviewed inspection reports, and quietly shifted funds from my retirement account into a certified investment transfer. It wasn't reckless. I had the means, and frankly, I'd never felt more focused in my life. I didn't tell anyone, not even Frank. The best part, the current HOA lease didn't include a renewal clause. If the new property owner didn't extend their lease, they'd have 30 days to vacate. That's all I needed. 30 days. 30 days to flip the script. To remind Karen and her cronies that power is only real if we let them have it. And when the papers were finally signed, when the ink dried on the deed and my LLC officially owned the office the HOA operated out of, I poured myself a glass of Carol's favorite red wine, stepped out onto the porch, and raised a quiet toast to the sage green walls around me. Let the games begin. The morning after the deal closed, I drove by the strip mall like a stranger, slowly windows rolled down, sunglasses on. Unit 9 looked as dull and unassuming as ever beige, stucco, a crooked number plaque, and a faded HOA sign bolted to the glass door that read, "By appointment only." That door now technically belonged to me. But I didn't stop. I just kept driving, planning my next move, with the kind of careful patience that had once made me a reliable engineer, a steady husband, and now an underestimated man with legal ownership of the battleground. I spent the next several days, not gloating, but observing. I became a ghost in Maple Ridge the way Carol used to call it when I got too quiet. "You disappear, but you're always watching," she would say, half worried, half proud. And watch I did. Every HOA board member who stepped into Unit 9, every courier dropping off envelopes, every Wednesday night community meeting. They were still operating under the assumption that they had time, that they had authority, that they were safe. They weren't. I wasn't interested in revenge for revenge's sake. I wasn't even angry anymore. What I wanted was transparency, fairness. I wanted to expose how deeply the HOA relied on its smoke and mirrors show of force, and how vulnerable that force was when someone finally turned on the lights. That's when the idea of a broader inspection took root. You see, while the HOA had spent the past month nitpicking my house, down to the color swatch, they'd completely ignored their own responsibilities. Fire hydrants, overgrown with ivy. Electrical boxes with exposed wiring near the children's playground. Sidewalks cracked wide enough for someone to trip and shatter a hip. And this was the kicker: no formal safety inspections logged in the community files for over 6 years. 6. As someone who once held a Class A contractor's license and spent decades auditing fire codes, this wasn't just negligence, it was dangerous. So I dusted off my clipboard, pulled my old inspection tools from the garage, and created a checklist, not as a homeowner, but as a citizen, as someone with a right to walk his own neighborhood and document what had been ignored. And I did it quietly. At 6 a.m., while most folks were still inside nursing coffee, I strolled the blocks like a retiree with too much time. But instead of gossip, I gathered data, took photos, measured sidewalk gaps, jotted down dates, times, locations. A few people waved at me. One or two asked what I was doing. Just checking on some things, I'd reply with a smile. Then I'd snap another photo of a dried-out pine leaning over a children's sandbox. By the end of the week, I had a 38-page report, and the crown jewel, Karen's house. I hadn't planned to target her directly, but the evidence practically begged for it. Her side yard was an unpermitted storage pit, piles of old wood plastic bins, even a rusted-out grill sitting under an awning of frayed tarpaulin. Her backyard shed had exposed extension cords running from an open window, and the rear gate, a required egress point for emergency response, was chained shut with a padlock. In other words, a fire hazard, a code violation, and a hypocritical mess. I took photos from the sidewalk, zoomed in with a telephoto lens I still had from my home renovation days. Everything legal, everything precise. Then I organized the report with tabbed sections: fire risks, electrical violations, accessibility hazards, environmental negligence. I printed 3 copies. One I mailed to the city's code enforcement department with a cover letter signed by me listing myself as a concerned resident and retired safety auditor. The second I placed in a sealed manila envelope and slid under the door of Unit 9, still technically their office, though they didn't know I was the landlord yet. And the third I kept for myself in a neat leather folder, ready for the moment when they'd accuse me again of being a nuisance, a troublemaker, an eyesore in their carefully curated world. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, an unmarked city vehicle rolled through the neighborhood. 2 officials stepped out with clipboards. By the time they left, half the HOA common areas had yellow tags on the gate's caution tape around a retaining wall that had begun to crumble, and 2 notices of non-compliance were posted at the community pool. Word traveled fast. Neighbors who'd been silent started asking questions. What's going on? Who called the city? Why is Karen panicking? And Karen, oh, she was livid. I saw her pacing in front of her house, talking on her phone, pointing at the tags like they were graffiti. She had no idea the person responsible was watching from 2 houses down sipping iced tea. By Friday, I got a letter from the HOA, another violation notice. But this one wasn't about paint. It was about interference with the HOA's functional processes and property oversight duties. I laughed. Interference, they didn't know the half of it, because on Monday they'd receive something even more potent than a city violation. They'd receive a certified letter bearing the letterhead of Maple Ridge Holdings, LLC. And in it, a very simple line effective immediately. Please prepare to vacate Unit 9 by the end of the month. I didn't sleep much the night before the letter was delivered. Not out of nerves, but anticipation. There's a certain quiet that comes when you know you're finally turning a page. I stood at my kitchen window just before dawn watching the light break over the neighborhood rooftops, coffee in hand. That little strip mall, the one where Unit 9 squatted like a monument to arbitrary power, looked almost peaceful from a distance. Almost, but I knew what was coming. The certified letter arrived at 10:43 a.m. I know the time because I watched the mail carrier step into the HOA's office with a neon green envelope in hand, one I had specifically requested to ensure visibility. A few minutes later, the door opened again. Karen stepped outside with the envelope pressed to her chest, face pale eyes scanning the street like she expected someone to jump out from behind a bush, yelling, "Gotcha!" But there was no punchline. Just a legally binding notice signed by me under the corporate entity Maple Ridge Holdings, LLC, stating that their lease on Unit 9 was terminated effective 30 days from receipt. No renewal, no negotiation. Within hours, the HOA board was in crisis mode. They called for an emergency session. I didn't attend. Instead, I sat in the backyard with a sandwich and watched as a steady stream of confused board members came and went, their voices escalating behind the thin office walls. I imagined the flurry of emails, the frantic Googling of lease agreements, the realization that somehow, some way, the very ground they operated from had shifted underneath them, and they had no clue who was holding the deed. But they would soon. 3 days later, Karen knocked on my door. It was surreal opening it to her after months of snide letters, backhanded comments, and public humiliation. She didn't smile. She didn't even pretend to be polite. "We received an eviction notice," she said flatly, "from Maple Ridge Holdings." I nodded. "I know." Her eyes narrowed. "Do you know who that is?" I sipped my coffee. "I might." She stared at me, lips tightening. "Well, we're filing an appeal. This has to be a mistake." "No mistake," I said. "You've got 27 days left." She blinked. "You're evicting the HOA. I'm evicting a tenant whose lease expired and who is now occupying the property without the owner's consent." Standard business. Karen took a shaky breath. "You can't do this. I already have." She looked down at her clipboard, her ever-present prop, and I swear for a moment she looked lost. Not angry, not arrogant, just stunned. "What do you want?" she asked finally, voice brittle. I thought about that for a moment. I want my house to stay painted the color I chose. I want to stop receiving threat letters for having solar lights. I want my neighbors to feel like neighbors, not informants. And I want people like you to stop using this HOA to bully homeowners into compliance with your personal taste. That's not how we operate, she snapped. "It's exactly how you operate," I said, stepping closer, "but it ends now." She left without another word. Over the next 2 weeks, a quiet panic settled over the board. Their meetings grew shorter. They stopped walking the neighborhood with clipboards. The violation notices slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. It was as if the air had shifted, like they could feel the grip slipping from their fingers. On the 26th day, I delivered another letter. This one was hand-signed, delivered with civility, and offered them a temporary solution. Maple Ridge Holdings, LLC is willing to lease Unit 9 for 1 additional month at double the current rate contingent on your immediate resignation as president and agreement to hold a full community election for a new board. I gave them 48 hours to respond. Karen didn't reply, but the board did. The next morning, I received an email from the treasurer. She confirmed they had accepted the terms. Karen would step down, and the HOA would, for the first time in its history, allow the entire neighborhood to vote on leadership instead of being appointed internally. It was done. That evening, I stood in the strip mall parking lot as a new locksmith changed the codes on Unit 9's door. I didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. More like relieved. Like a long-held breath had finally been released. I didn't want control. I didn't want power. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was respect, fairness, and a space to grieve and rebuild in peace. As the sun set behind the ridge, casting golden light across the parking lot, I felt Carol beside me. Not literally. But in that quiet, in the way the wind shifted and the light held still for just a second, I felt her. She would have smiled, maybe even said, "You took the high road, but damn if you didn't pave your own highway too." I chuckled to myself. It was time to paint again. The next morning, I printed 6 copies of the final eviction notice, clean, legal, precise. No emotion, no spite, just ink and law. It was addressed to the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association care of its current board members, and it stated what the letter from the holding company only hinted at. This time, it was from me in my own name. It read, "To the members of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. This letter serves as formal notice that you are hereby required to vacate Unit 9 of the Maple Ridge Commons building within 30 calendar days of receipt. The current lease expired on date and has not been renewed. Effective immediately, you are considered occupants at will and must remove all HOA property from the premises by close of business on date. Failure to comply will result in legal proceedings for unlawful detainer. Sincerely, Thomas Reed, owner, Maple Ridge Commons." I delivered them myself. Karen wasn't there that day. Maybe she couldn't face it. Maybe she was at the county clerk's office trying to dig up anything, any clause, any loophole that could stop what was already inevitable. But the rest of the board was present, eyes wide as saucers, when I walked through the door and laid the letters on their table. No one said a word. The treasurer, the only one who had ever spoken to me like a human being, gave me a slight nod, almost apologetic. The secretary just stared at the notice like it was written in another language. I walked out without looking back. Within hours, the emails started. Requests for extensions. Questions about potential compromise. One board member asked if I would consider leasing the space back to the HOA indefinitely at a lower rate, claiming that continuity of operations was in the best interest of the neighborhood. I declined them all. What followed was the sound of scrambling. They set up a folding table in the community park, holding makeshift meetings under a pop-up tent as they tried to maintain the appearance of authority. But the illusion was breaking down. Homeowners started asking questions, real questions. Why are we having meetings outside? Why are my dues going towards storage units? Why hasn't the board explained what happened? The power dynamic was shifting, and fast. And as it shifted, something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors started talking again. Not about paint colors or lawn lengths, but about change. It started with a small group of residents forming an independent committee, one that wasn't part of the HOA board, but simply concerned citizens. They asked for a full accounting of dues spent over the last 5 years. They asked for a digital copy of all violation records. They asked for and received a list of every board member's term length, appointment date, and renewal history. And when they realized no one on the board had ever been formally elected, the outrage was instantaneous. Karen returned the following week, striding across the park in a too-stiff blazer, trying to assert some form of control. But the crowd had already turned. I stayed at the edge of the field, arms folded, watching it unfold. A woman named Melissa, a retired school principal who'd never spoken up at a meeting before, stepped forward with a binder thick with printouts. "We've checked the bylaws," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Nowhere does it say board positions are lifetime appointments. Nowhere does it say homeowners can't vote. We're calling for a full election. We have more than the required 20% signatures. It's happening." Karen tried to laugh it off. "You don't understand the administrative structure." Melissa cut her off. "No, you don't understand. You don't own the office anymore. You don't control the mail. And for the first time, you don't have a space to hide behind." The silence was thunderous. I almost felt sorry for Karen. Almost. I watched her sputter, then retreat into a crowd that no longer looked at her with admiration, but with suspicion. By the time the eviction deadline came around, the HOA's possessions had been moved into a rented trailer parked outside one of the board members' homes. Their banner, once proudly hung outside Unit 9, now sat folded under a tablecloth. The once powerful title of president had become a punchline whispered between lawnmowers and mailboxes. And me, I stepped into Unit 9 and took a deep breath. The place was small, slightly musty, and had too many chairs, but it was mine. I donated a portion of the space to the new community committee, no strings attached. A table, some chairs, a coffee machine. A space for real dialogue. No bylaws, no fines, just people. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't come in handcuffs or gavel pounds. Sometimes justice comes in the form of a building key handed to the people who had none before. Sometimes justice is eviction in reverse. The emergency meeting was announced with all the urgency of a collapsing empire. A poorly printed flyer tucked into mailboxes. A mass email from a Gmail account rather than the official HOA server. A lawn sign, hand-lettered in marker stuck near the front entrance of the subdivision, that read, "Community Meeting, Urgent Agenda. This Wednesday, 6 p.m., Park Pavilion." They were out of options, and they knew it. Wednesday arrived cloaked in the golden haze of a summer evening. Cicadas hummed like distant applause, and the Park Pavilion, a once-forgotten concrete slab, with a cracked roof and rusted picnic tables, suddenly became the site of reckoning. I walked in carrying nothing but a folder under one arm, and the weight of 2 years' worth of petty war on my shoulders. Around me, neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months, nodded politely, some clapping me on the back, others whispering quietly as I passed. Karen was already there, pacing behind the center table, like a defendant waiting for the verdict. Her usual bravado was still there, pressed blouse, perfect posture, the HOA binder clutched like a lifeline, but the eyes around her no longer offered loyalty, only scrutiny. She tapped a microphone that wasn't plugged in, then gave up and raised her voice. "This meeting has been called to discuss recent events that have affected the operations of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association," she said, voice taut like piano wire. "It is our goal to bring clarity, order, and accountability." Someone called from the crowd. She flinched, but forced a smile. "Yes, that too." I stepped forward. "I have a few words," I said. There was a murmur. She tried to object. This is a board meeting, not an open floor, but it was too late. The tide had turned. The people wanted to hear it. I unfolded a single sheet of paper. "This is the deed to the building at Maple Ridge Commons Unit 9, the space you've occupied as the official office of the HOA for the past 10 years. As of 2 months ago, I own it. The lease was not renewed. You've been evicted. This is public record." A ripple went through the crowd, part disbelief, part exhilaration. Karen stood up, voice rising. "You manipulated this whole situation," I nodded, calm. "I followed the law. You enforced rules that didn't exist. You fined me $1,000 over paint, then tried to lien my house. You ostracized me publicly. I fought back legally." Someone in the back shouted, "You go, paint guy!" Laughter broke out, relieving, cathartic. "But this isn't about revenge," I continued. "It's about who gets to have a voice in their own neighborhood. About whether power serves people or people serve power." I gestured to the crowd. "This community deserves better than a group of unelected individuals holding closed-door meetings in borrowed buildings while threatening fines over lawn decor and mailbox sizes." Melissa stood next. "We've gathered 38% of homeowner signatures. According to the bylaws, that's more than enough to call for a full vote to dissolve the current board and hold open elections." Karen turned pale. "You can't do that," she hissed. "Actually," Melissa replied, "we already did." Another ripple, this time thunderous. Applause, cheering, neighbors embracing. It was as if years of whispered frustration had suddenly found a megaphone. I watched Karen shrink, not physically, but in presence. The power she wielded had been paper-thin all along. All it took was someone willing to challenge it. I stayed behind after the meeting, helping fold chairs and gather empty water bottles. Melissa handed me a cookie from a paper plate and smiled. "You ever think about running for president?" she joked. I laughed. "I just wanted to repaint my house." She grinned. and ended up repainting the whole neighborhood. Later that night, I stood on my porch as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. The house glowed warm in its now iconic color, bold, defiant, and finally accepted. From somewhere down the street came the smell of barbecue. Someone playing guitar, laughter. No citations, no threats, just community, just peace. The morning after the meeting felt different, not just for me, but for the whole neighborhood. It was as if the heavy fog of anxiety that had hung over Maple Ridge for years had finally lifted. I walked out onto my porch with a cup of black coffee, the sun just cresting the tops of the tall pine trees at the edge of the cul-de-sac. For the first time since I moved in, I didn't brace myself for a notice taped to my door or a sideways glance from a neighbor. I simply breathed. The front of my house shimmered in the morning light, painted in that same warm, deep blue that Karen had once declared an offense to community standards. But now it didn't feel like defiance. It felt like declaration. A declaration that this was my home, and I had earned the right to live in it without fear of arbitrary punishment. As I watered the flower beds, two older neighbors I'd barely spoken to strolled by. They stopped. "Looks real nice," the husband said, adjusting his cap. "Better than beige if you ask me." "Glad you stood up to them," his wife added with a kind smile. We were scared to say anything. I nodded, not with pride, but with understanding. "Fear doesn't build communities," I said. "Conversation does." That weekend, the neighborhood came alive. It started with a small invitation I posted on the newly unmoderated HOA board community cookout. "Everyone welcome, Saturday 5 p.m. Bring something to share." I didn't expect much, maybe a few curious faces. A neighbor or two who'd been secretly rooting for me from behind their curtains. What happened blew me away. By 5 o'clock, the cul-de-sac was filled with folding tables, slow cookers, lawn chairs, and kids riding bikes. Someone had brought a Bluetooth speaker and played classic soul and Motown. A young couple roasted marshmallows in a fire pit. Melissa brought her famous peach cobbler and handed out sticky plates like they were acts of resistance. I'd set up my old grill, the very one that started it all, beneath the same awning where I once received my first violation notice. Now it was crowned with a string of lights and surrounded by neighbors waiting for a taste of my ribs. "Not gonna lie," said Marcus, a father of 3, who used to avoid eye contact with me. "Karen made me scared to talk to you. I didn't want trouble." I nodded. "I get it." He looked me in the eye. "But you changed things, for all of us." Kids ran by, squealing with glee, as someone fired up sparklers. Karen's house stood dark and silent at the edge of the street. She'd resigned quietly 2 days after the vote, packed up her binder, took down her little sign about dog poop fines, and disappeared. No one really missed her, not because they hated her, but because fear isn't a healthy way to lead. Later that night, as the last of the party faded and the stars blinked into view, I found myself standing alone at the end of the driveway. I looked back at the house, its new paint, the porch swing I'd finally installed, the flower beds that now bloomed without judgment. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was freedom. It was healing. It was proof that one person armed with persistence and a little bit of strategy could shift the balance of power, not through anger or retaliation, but through integrity and quiet resolve. My late wife Marlene would have loved this place. I imagined her smile, her approval of the paint color, her laugh at the absurdity of it all. I whispered into the breeze, "We did good, sweetheart." And in that moment, beneath the soft hum of crickets and the last glow of the grill, I finally felt at peace. Not just because I had won, but because we all had.